Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Hi everyone, I'm back again to go over another historical true crime case, and this goes over the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. And this case has remained well known among the public because of its violent nature and the fact that it was allegedly committed by a woman. It is also considered an unsolved case because although Lizzie was put on trial, she was acquitted of the crime. So there are a few theories about whether or not Lizzie was actually guilty or if she was wrongfully accused of the murders. So let's get started with a little background about Lizzie, her family, and what was going on in the Borden household during that time. Lizzie Andrew Borden was born on July 19th, 1860 in Fall River, Massachusetts. Her parents were Sarah and Andrew Borden. She was of English and Welsh descent. Although Lizzie's father grew up very poor, he became a very rich man due to his various business enterprises during Lizzie's childhood and young adulthood. And they included being a property developer. He owned several commercial properties. He sold caskets and furniture. And then he was also the president of the Union Savings Bank and director of the Durfee Safe Deposit and Trust Company. So her father was very busy during this time, but he acquired a lot of wealth as a result. Lizzie had one older sister who was named Emma Lenora Borden, and she was raised in a very religious home. She was involved in many church activities and she taught Sunday school. Lizzie was a member of the Christian Endeavor Society and a part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In 1863, when Lizzie was only 3 years old, her mother died. And 3 years later, in 1866, Andrew remarried to a woman named Abby Gray. Lizzie had a very formal relationship with her stepmother, and she believed that Abby had married her father simply because he was wealthy. In the Borden home resided Lizzie and Emma, Andrew, a live-in maid named Bridget, and of course their stepmother. Maggie would later testify that it was very tense in the Borden home for many years, and that the girls went so far as to even avoid eating dinner with their parents because they did not get along with their stepmother and had a very strained relationship with their father. In 1892, the tension in the household had gotten much worse, and it was so bad that both sisters actually left and went to New Bedford for extended vacations that year. After returning to their family home in Fall River, Lizzie actually stayed at a rooming house for 4 days before she finally went home, and this was 1 week before the murder occurred. Part of the reason for the tension in the family home was because Andrew had started giving monetary gifts and large presents to members of Abby's family, and the sisters, Emma and Lizzie, didn't like that. They actually demanded that their father give them together one of his rental properties for the cost of $1, and they actually sold it back to him later on for $5,000, which was $142,000 today, would be the equivalent amount. So the sisters were angry about how he was spending so much money on Abby's family and didn't seem to be taking care of his children with the same type of generosity. So the night before the murders, Lizzie's uncle actually arrived at the family house to discuss other business issues with Andrew. There was speculation that this visit only led to increasing the tension in the family home, although I was unable to find any details about what they were discussing exactly. Of note, a few days before the murders occurred, the entire family had been violently ill, and while they assumed it was simply food poisoning, Abby, the girl's stepmother, was afraid that the family was being poisoned because Andrew was not popular in the community and he wasn't very popular at home either. So it's interesting to note that Abby was a little bit paranoid during that time, right before she got murdered, that something wasn't right in the household. On August 4th, the household was full of people. Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, her Uncle John, and the maid were all at the house that day. In the early morning, John, her uncle, and her father continued their business conversation. John eventually left to go buy a pair of oxen and visit some other family in town, and he planned to return to the house around noon for lunch. Andrew left the house at 9 a.m. to go for his daily walk. And that was his routine, so everyone knew that he would be out of the house during that time. Abby, Lizzie's stepmother, went upstairs to clean the guest room, even though that was normally a job that Lizzie would have done. It was sometime between 9 a.m. and 10:30 when Abby was upstairs that she was killed. She was struck in the head just above her ear with a hatchet, and she fell face down on the floor, which caused a bunch of contusions on her nose and over her face. Her killer then continued to hit Abby with the hatchet 17 more times, with direct hits to the back of her head. So Abby was pretty violently murdered, and to the point of being brutal and excessive. There was no way she probably could have survived the initial blow to the side of her head, yet they kept going 17 more times. That's a lot, if you think about it. At 10:30 a.m., Andrew returned to the home, but his key was not working, so he knocked on the door. The maid tried to answer it, but the door was jammed. Maggie, the maid, her name was Bridget, but she went by Maggie, would later testify that she heard Lizzie laughing loudly from the top of the stairs at that moment. This is pretty significant because Lizzie could not have missed seeing her dead stepmother in the guest room if she had been upstairs during that time. During the investigation, Lizzie vehemently denied being upstairs at the time in question. When they finally got their father into the house, he asked Lizzie directly where her stepmother was, and she replied that a messenger had arrived at the house with a request for Abby to go visit a sick friend. Lizzie later claimed that she helped her father remove his boots, and gave him slippers for him to take a nap in the parlor downstairs. This is really significant because in all of the photos of Andrew's body, he is still wearing his boots. Lizzie then told the maid about a sale at a department store and encouraged her to go to it. But Maggie wasn't feeling well because she had spent the entire morning washing windows and wanted to go to bed instead. So at this point, Andrew is downstairs taking a nap. Abby is upstairs, still undiscovered, in the second floor guest room, and Maggie, the maid, has gone upstairs to the third floor to take a nap, leaving Lizzie alone, basically wandering around the house during that time. At 11:10 a.m., Maggie was awoken by the sound of Lizzie screaming from the downstairs lounge. She screamed that her father had been murdered. Andrew was slumped in the couch and had been struck 10 or 11 times with a hatchet. It was so violent that one of his eyeballs had been cut in half, suggesting that he had been asleep at the time of the murder. The state of the wounds indicated the attack was very recent, probably no more than 10 minutes before Lizzie found the body. So, after we had the whole Abby was beaten 17 times, hit 17 times with this hatchet, Andrew was hit, but face on, 10 more times with a hatchet as well. When the police arrived at the scene, Lizzie offered strange and contradicting answers to the police question. At first, she claimed to have heard a distress call before entering the house, but 2 hours later, she changed her story and said she hadn't heard anything. It wasn't until the police were investigating Andrew's murder that Maggie and a neighbor discovered Abby's body upstairs, so this whole time they just thought that Andrew had been murdered, and later on they discovered Abby's body upstairs. Many officers at the scene noticed that Lizzie looked very calm and poised, too much so during the investigation. Although she was acting strangely and the questions the police were asking kept receiving different answers, no one thought to check Lizzie herself for any bloodstains or anything like that, because she wasn't considered a suspect at that time. And remember, 1860, the idea that a woman would have committed such a violent act would have been probably pretty crazy to any of the police, so they just weren't thinking of her as a suspect at that moment. Although they noticed that she was really, really relaxed for what was happening, and she couldn't seem to get her story straight. They also took a cursory look around her room, but Lizzie claimed that she wasn't feeling very good, so they didn't do an in-depth search of Lizzie's room at that time. In the basement of the house, 2 hatchets along with 2 axes and another broken hatchet were discovered. And this is interesting because the broken hatchet, the handle had broken off, and when police discovered it on the ground, they noted that it looked like someone had smeared dust and ash on it to make it look like it had been laying there for a while. But when they were looking at it, the break looked very recent, so they assumed that somebody had planted it there after they had committed the murders with that particular hatchet and just tried to make it look like it had been there for a while, suggesting that it was someone who knew that the Bordens not only kept hatchets in their basement, but also that they weren't used very frequently. But in another instance of the police really not investigating thoroughly and doing a good job, they left all of them there, including the broken hatchet. Because of the mysterious illness that had gone around the household a few days before the murder, both bodies were tested for poison, but nothing was found. The night after the murder, Lizzie and Emma stayed in the home with their friend Alice, the maid, and their Uncle John. Police were stationed around the house at that time and witnessed Lizzie entering the cellar with her friend Alice, and she was carrying a kerosene lamp and a slop pail. Police saw them leave the cellar, but Lizzie actually returned alone again, and although they couldn't see what she was doing, it looked like she was bent over a sink. The next day, their uncle wanted to leave the home, but he was mobbed by hundreds of people. It wasn't until August 6th that the police conducted another search of the house, so 2 days later, and finally inspected the sisters' clothes and removed the broken hatchet. They also informed Lizzie that she was a suspect in the crime. The next day, August 7th, Lizzie's friend Alice found Lizzie in the kitchen, tearing up a dress that she had been wearing the day of the murders. Lizzie claimed she'd gotten paint all over the dress and decided to burn it. So, kind of a weird situation that the police finally started to zero in on Lizzie because she was acting weird following the murders, and told her about it. And the following day, Lizzie is getting rid of the outfit she wore the day of the murders. On August 8th, Lizzie appeared at the inquest hearing. She wanted her attorney present, but it was denied as state statute indicated an inquest must be held in private. At that time, Lizzie had been regularly taking morphine for her nerves, and it was possible that it impacted her testimony and answers. She often refused to answer questions, even ones that might have benefited her case. In the investigation, Lizzie said she had been in the kitchen reading a magazine when her father arrived home. She then changed to she was sitting in the dining room ironing, and then finally said she was coming down the stairs when he arrived at the house. She then insisted again that she had helped her father remove his boots before he took a nap. Again, Andrew was discovered wearing his boots, but this was one part of the story that Lizzie had kept pretty consistent throughout. The DA was very aggressive and confrontational during this questioning. On August 11th, Lizzie was served with a warrant and arrested. During her trial later, the inquest was ruled inadmissible. Although her answers and behavior during the inquest received a lot of attention, it was not included in the actual case. It also caused a divide between Lizzie's friends and acquaintances in their opinion of her involvement with the crime. So Lizzie is facing the court of public opinion, basically. People knew that she was acting weird after the murders. They knew that her answers were not stacking up during the inquest, and they were starting to make their own decisions about whether or not Lizzie had been involved in the crime. Lizzie's trial began in New Bedford on June 5th, 1893. The prosecutor in the case was Hosea M. Knowlton. Ironically, 5 days before the trial began, another hatchet murder occurred in Lizzie's hometown. The jurors knew about the case, and one could question if it influenced their conduct during the case. But it should be noted that the killer in that instance was found, tried, and convicted later on. But at the time of Lizzie's case, it comes to light that someone else was murdered in a very similar way while Lizzie was locked up, awaiting trial. And if the jurors knew that, it might make them question about whether or not somebody else had broken into Lizzie's home and she was being wrongfully accused of the crime. The biggest evidence in the case was the hatchet that had been found in the basement. Although officers contradicted when and where the broken hatchet was discovered, including about whether the handle was broken off, or if the broken off handle had ever been found, there was also an issue that no bloody clothing had been found at the scene, despite the testimony that Lizzie had been seen burning a dress. When Lizzie had been in the house at the time of the murders was also a big issue. The maid testified Lizzie was in the house, but Lizzie claimed to have gone out to the barn. Several witnesses claimed they had witnessed Lizzie leaving the barn at 11:03, and at 11:10 she had called the maid to tell her that her father was murdered. So these are the big points in this case. The broken hatchet, which police were not agreeing on if the broken hatchet, if the handle had been there originally, when they found it, and when they finally took it away. The other issue was about the fact that, Lizzie had been seen burning a dress a few days later, which looked suspect. And then the biggest question was Lizzie in the house when the murders occurred, or was she out like she said? And remember, she gave different accounts of the story from the day the murders occurred right up until the inquest. And if you think about it, if witnesses actually saw Lizzie enter the house at 11:03, and she said at 11:10 she discovered her father's body, she either had to kill him right before that, because remember, the wounds looked really recent, almost within 10 minutes, or she killed him during that 7-minute window before calling the maid downstairs. So there are a lot of variables in this case which made it very hard to prove Lizzie's innocence or guilt. After several days of testimony, the jury met for only an hour and a half and acquitted Lizzie of the crime. Lizzie told reporters as she exited the courtroom that she was the happiest woman in the world. So there was a lot of speculation about this case during and after. And although she was acquitted, Lizzie remains a prime suspect in the case to this day. There are many theories about Lizzie's potential motives, including potential abuse by her father, or whether or not it was the financial issues that I had mentioned earlier. The girl's friend Alice stayed with them after the murders and claimed on her deathbed that she had changed her testimony during the trial to protect Lizzie. There is another theory that Lizzie might be innocent of the crime and that it was actually her Uncle John, who was sort of a red herring during this whole thing, might have been the culprit after all. He rarely saw Lizzie or her sister afterward, but law enforcement noticed that he had claimed to have provided an overly elaborate alibi for himself at the time of the murders. So remember, he was conveniently gone when the murders occurred to go buy some oxen and then go visit a family member, which left him unaccounted for during that entire span of time. And there was the business conversations him and Andrew had been having the night before and the morning of. So best bet about whether or not John actually snuck back into the house and committed the murders and basically framed Lizzie, took advantage of the fact that she was there, So that's up for debate. People wonder about his whole role, especially since he wanted to leave the house so quickly after the murders occurred. After the trial, the Borden sisters moved into a large modern house in the Hill neighborhood of Fall River. Around this time, Lizzie began using her name Lizbeth A. Borden. At their new house, which Lizbeth dubbed Maple Croft, they had a staff that included live-in maids, a housekeeper, and a coachman. Because Abby was ruled to have died before Andrew, her estate went first to Andrew and then at his death passed to his daughters as part of this estate, which was a considerable settlement. Despite the acquittal, Lizzie was ostracized by Fall River society. Her name was again brought into the public eye when she was accused of shoplifting in 1897 in Providence, Rhode Island. In 1905, shortly after an argument over a party that Lizbeth had given for actress Nance O'Neill, Emma moved out of the house, and she never saw her sister again. Lizzie fell ill in her last year, following the removal of her gallbladder, and she died of pneumonia on June 1st, 1927, in Fall River. Funeral details were never published, and very few people attended. 9 days later, her sister Emma died from chronic nephritis at the age of 76 in a nursing home in New Hampshire, having moved to this location in 1923 for health reasons and to avoid renewed publicity following the publication of another book about the murders. The sisters, neither of whom ever had married, were buried side by side in the family plot in Oak Grove Cemetery. At the time of her death, Borden was worth over $250,000, which would be the equivalent of almost $5 million in 2019. She owned a house on the corner of French Street and Belmont Street, several office buildings, shares in several utilities, 2 cars, and a large amount of jewelry. And she left that estate to various family members and friends and different organizations. So, that is the case of Lizzie Borden. And I find it to be very interesting. One, because she was a woman, and the type of violent crime is sort of atypical behavior. Not that it's unheard of, but bludgeoning someone with a hatchet is pretty hardcore. So I would be interested to know what you think after hearing some of the details of the case. If you think Lizzie Borden did it, if you think maybe she was falsely accused, I'd be interested to know your theories on it. Be on the lookout for another case coming soon on Amelia Earhart and the conspiracy theories surrounding her disappearance. I hope everyone is staying safe and staying healthy and has a wonderful weekend.